I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times. Welcome to the new home of the New York Times Close Up, CUNY TV, after more than 24 years at New York One News. We'll continue to focus our attention on local issues that concern Times readers, with previews of articles in the weekend sections of the Times. We'll resume our weekly Reporters Roundtable with a feature we'll now call The Backstory. And I'll give my own analysis of the week's events with Coda. Joining me first this week, James B. Milliken, the Chancellor of the City University of New York. He presides over the largest urban university system in the country. Also, Chris McNickle joins us. Times op-ed page columnist David Leonhardt reviews Chris's latest work, Bloomberg, A Billionaire's Ambition, in this Sunday's Times book review. Joining us on the backstory, Times journalists Clyde Haberman, Eleanor Randolph, and Alexander Burns. But first, Chancellor James B. Milliken of the City University of New York. Freshman applications up 9% this year, almost a record of applications from the city's highest achieving high schools. When people say college education doesn't matter anymore, the cost is too high, why this counterintuitive trend at CUNY?
Well, CUNY's at a special place in higher education in this country. First of all, about 70% of our students don't pay tuition because of federal Pell Grants, state TAP, and now the Excelsior Scholarship Program. So first of all, there's a terrific value for students at CUNY. 80% of our students leave without federal debt. This is an unusual picture if you look across the country at public higher education. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we're a university of strivers. 40% of our students were born outside of the United States, a very significant number of low-income students and underrepresented students. So if you asked those students and their parents whether they think college matters, I think you'd get a resounding yes. These are people with ambition, with grit, with talent, and are looking for what CUNY has provided for generations to a similar population in New York.
Last spring, a record number of graduates, something like 52,000, an amazing number. How about graduation rates? Are they keeping pace?
So this is one of the things that we are focused on at CUNY in our strategic plan and everything we do. We've adopted a culture of completion. You know, for many years in this country, the focus was on access and on keeping tuition low, on providing adequate aid through the Pell program and others, and inadequate attention, not just at CUNY, but many other places, I think, on finishing in a timely way, because the worst problems with repayment of outstanding debt are for people who don't finish and who still owe but haven't got the benefit that a college degree brings. So this culture of completion, the kinds of programs that exist at CUNY to help people graduate on time, ASAP being a prime example where we've doubled and tripled the community college graduation rates. This is number one on our list. 52,000 is a record by a long ways in terms of graduates. The more students we graduate, the more lives we impact and the better it is for New York City.
What about the fact that so many of these students are not fully prepared when they come to CUNY? Something like, it's a record high now, I think, but 37% of the entering students to the community colleges are not college proficient in math and English. What does that say about the New York City schools?
Well, so I'm not going to cast the blame anywhere. We're in a cycle here, a virtuous cycle. We produce the largest producer of teachers in the public schools in New York. Most of our students come from the public schools in New York. So we think there are things we can do with DOE to help students be college ready. You know, if you really want to start at the beginning, it's early childhood development and education, where CUNY is a national leader in this area. But we need to work with parents and young children so that they are prepared for universal pre-K, so they're prepared for kindergarten and beyond, so that they haven't lost time, they haven't lost track along the way. You can't start getting students college ready in their senior year of high school.
Does remediation work in college?
So remediation works, but for too few students. And we've spent a year at CUNY studying the best practices across the country in remediation, and we are transforming the remediation programs at CUNY this year. We're putting more students into credit-bearing courses earlier so that they get the benefit of spending the time and the effort and the money pursuing what will eventually be a college degree. We have programs like CUNY Start and Mass Start that are almost boot camps, would be the analogy, to have people focus in a short period of time on getting through the especially math requirements, which have been such a problem for many of our entering students. So we're doing better, and we're going to get more students through remediation and get them on the path to graduation more quickly.
CUNY has thousands of kids affected by the DREAM Act. What is the university doing to protect them, regardless of what Congress and the president do?
Right. So I'd say CUNY has done more than any university in the country. First, for Dreamers, we have thousands and thousands of undocumented students across CUNY. We probably have between 1,000 and 2,000 DACA students who would be affected by what day is it? I can't tell whether DACA is in or out today, but we're 100% behind it. There's a national program called the Dream.us started by Don Graham to raise money for Dreamers because they're not eligible for federal or state tax-supported grants. CUNY has the largest number of these Dream.us privately funded scholars of any university in the country, with 740 of them studying at CUNY with privately funded scholarships. That's part of our commitment. Another part is the Citizenship Now program, which has existed for years and is the premier university-based program in the country for aiding with immigration issues for the whole range of students and their parents and other members in the community. We joined the Attorney General last week, Attorney General Schneiderman, as part of the lawsuit with 15 states suing the federal government over the end to the DACA program. And the next day we did a national, I guess it's international, but in this case, national focus, a Facebook Live session for an hour and a half with our leaders from Citizenship Now, the state immigration leaders and the city immigration leaders, to answer questions, and it was subscribed to by many, many people across the country. So we're a resource for CUNY students, but also for people across America.
Quick last question. Thanks to the governor, you removed 2 statues of Confederate generals at the Hall of Fame uptown at Bronx Community College. Last spring at City College, there were criticisms about inviting a Muslim American as the commencement speaker. What does all this say about academic freedom at CUNY?
Well, I think academic freedom at CUNY is pretty safe. The commencement went ahead without incident, and the reason that it went ahead is because we weren't going to withdraw an invitation in this case on the basis of the content of speech. CUNY has been a place that has had over the years robust free speech and protest and engagement by faculty and students, and it will continue to be. But free speech and academic freedom are our highest priorities at CUNY.
Thanks for joining us, Chancellor J.B. Milliken. And when we return, Chris McNickle, the author of Bloomberg, A Billionaire's Ambition. Welcome back. Chris McNickle, a lifelong New Yorker, an objective lover of it. His previous books, To Be Mayor of New York and The Power of the Mayor, David Dinkins, have brought him to his latest book, Bloomberg, A Billionaire's Ambition, just been published by Skyhorse Books, a foreword by Professor Kenneth D. Jackson, and reviewed in this Sunday's Times book review by Times op-ed columnist David Leonhardt. Where would you place Michael Bloomberg in the pantheon of New York City mayors?
Oh, way towards the top, Sam. He was an enormously successful mayor. He handled the fundamental aspects of a mayor's job, budget management, policing the city, public education in a very successful manner. And he did much more than that. He handled the economic development of the city in a way that's unique and very powerful. And I would say that the only mayor that we think of who had comparable impact on the city would be Fiorello LaGuardia. And of course, they governed the city in such different moments in time, it's hard to do a more sensitive comparison than that.
When we talk about change, obviously there were changes in the governance of the school system, for instance, but was there substantive change for the better?
There was. When Mr. Bloomberg ran for office, changing the school system, radical reform really, was a key part of his initial platform. And he followed through on it with Chancellor Joel Klein in particular. They made an enormous number of changes to empower principals, to attract high-caliber teachers, to create a different environment in the school system. They invested $27 billion. And they made progress, measurable progress, but you'd have to say it was less progress than they had hoped. They inherited a failing school system. When they were done, the system was better, but it still was nothing like the first-class school system that Mr. Bloomberg wanted it to be. And so the city continues to work to try and create the school system we all want the city to have. And like the rest of America, we're still struggling to find out how to do that, particularly with respect to large numbers of students in disadvantaged areas.
And in the book, you say he made available another 500,000 apartments in the city, yet we're still in a perpetual housing crisis. So is this a case of, like Mayor Koch saying, if you build it, they will come, we will always have a perpetual housing crisis?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. One view of what's going on is that the reason there are so many people who want to come to New York is because Mayor Bloomberg and continuing under Mayor de Blasio, New York City has become such a thriving, exciting place to live. And so people come as a consequence of Mayor Bloomberg's successes. The flip side to it is that the cost of living in New York City and the cost of housing increased way more than the average wage level during the same period of time. So you have two competing realities. One is that Mr. Bloomberg produced an enormous amount of affordable housing, not for the poorest, but for people at the lower end of the middle class, and yet it was insufficient for the numbers of people who keep coming to New York. So we do have this chicken or egg issue.
And in fact, Chris, you say he had a calculated negligence toward the poorest. What do you mean by that? The very poorest.
Sure. So Bloomberg has a very mixed record with respect to anti-poverty programs. There were an enormous number of programs that he invested in, hundreds of millions of dollars of his own money and billions of dollars of city money, to try and help people trying to get into the system to succeed. Investments in what's often called human capital. At the same time, simply remediation levels to try and reduce the impact of poverty on people, that wasn't where Bloomberg wanted to spend his money or his attention. He recognized that New York City has a very broad social net, and he was comfortable to leave it where it was and not to expand it. And I think that there was a concern that if it became too comfortable for poor people to be in New York City and it became too much of a concentrated part of the population, you end up like Detroit at its worst. And Mr. Bloomberg was conscious that he didn't want that for New York.
You interviewed a lot of people for this book. You didn't interview Michael Bloomberg. What would you have asked him?
I would have asked him just very open-ended to tell me what it was like to be mayor, what was most important about it, why did he do it, and what were his most important achievements in his mind. And I think once you get someone like Mr. Bloomberg talking about what's important to him, you just let him run.
Would he have made a good president?
I think he'd have been an excellent president.
Do Republicans only win the mayoralty when the city is in crisis?
Well, that's a theory that has been proposed. I think the Republicans only win the mayoralty when the Democratic Party splits. And we have in 2013 Mr. de Blasio running for office with the United Democratic Party, and he beat his Republican challenger 75% to 25% roughly. I think that's typical of much of New York City history. When you have a split in the Democratic Party, which can be induced by a crisis, but can be induced by other reasons, local politics, personalities, different considerations. When you get a split, that's when you can have a Republican mayor.
And what you have in de Blasio's case is the first progressive mayor, probably in a long time, who's come in relatively good times, and he has sort of proved that a liberal can govern. How much of that is the result of the city that Mayor Bloomberg left him?
I think a lot. In my own mind, Mr. de Blasio is the fortunate beneficiary, as are most New Yorkers, of the hard work done by Mayors Koch, Mayors Giuliani, and Mayor Bloomberg. And Mr. de Blasio has brought to it his own sensibilities and his own vision for New York City, one that focuses on income inequality and concentration of wealth. But he's able to do that and focus on those things because the fundamental responsibilities of the mayor are being handled because it's relatively easy to do right now. The economy's strong. He inherited a safe city with a strong police force. He inherited an education system that was stronger than the one that his predecessors had had. So that gives him the ability to focus on other matters that are also important.
Quickly, would he have won without the money he spent and without 9/11?
Would Michael Bloomberg have won?
Yes.
It's hard to see how. You can never prove the counterfactual, But as of the morning of September 11th, 2001, which was primary day as well as the day of 9/11, I'm unable to find a single political strategist who thought that Michael Bloomberg had a chance to win, including his own. And 8 weeks later, he won. Without 9/11, which changed so many things, including the political landscape of New York City, it's hard to see how Michael Bloomberg would ever have been mayor.
Thanks to Chris McNickle for joining us. Bloomberg, A Billionaire's Ambition, just been published by Skyhorse, reviewed in this Sunday's Times book review by the Times' David Leonhardt. And when we return, the backstory. Welcome back to my Times colleagues who return to discuss the week's big stories, contributing writers Clyde Haberman and Eleanor Randolph, and national political reporter and CNN analyst Alexander Burns. This week, the focus on forces of nature, partially prodded by our disregard of it, and the primary Tuesday brought few surprises and even fewer voters. The opening ceremony for Cornell Tech on Roosevelt Island, marked by fulsome praise for former Mayor Bloomberg, whose millions and commitment made the campus possible. Mayor de Blasio clearly not happy. As David Goodman reported in the Times this week, it was not exactly a victory lap for the mayor. He went to Roosevelt Island and he heard the governor praise Bloomberg. What did the mayor get out of this victory? I mean, on one sense, he obviously has done something right to get reelected, the first Democratic mayor since Ed Koch, who is likely to win a second term. On the other hand, what does it all mean?
You know, on Roosevelt Island, nobody ever knows really why Andrew Cuomo does what he does, but...
Yes, we do.
I think we know.
Yeah, we do.
No, come on, guys. No, and, you know, he goes out, there's de Blasio sitting right there. He's just won the primary. And there's Bloomberg sitting right there. And so Cuomo does everything he can to make Bloomberg look like Roosevelt. He even compared
Well, it is Roosevelt Island, after all.
It is Roosevelt Island, but come on. And at one point, he actually called him the mayor, you know, and so...
It's a little bit like what de Blasio did to Bloomberg at his inauguration.
Exactly. I was thinking the exact
well,
same thing.
that was the comparison that a lot of people made. It has to be said that de Blasio got up and was very gracious about Bloomberg and said, you know, I'm not a sycophant. I haven't been particularly nice about Bloomberg, but I have to say this is a really great addition to the city of New York.
You know, New Yorkers in politics, for sure, are utterly lacking in grace more times than is their right. I mean, so here's a day after de Blasio's primary victory. It wouldn't have killed the governor to at least give him a tip of the hat. Of course, he can't do it. Same thing, the utter gracelessness toward Bloomberg by every speaker at the de Blasio inauguration back in 2014. And go back to Elliot Spitzer, with George Pataki, whatever you think of George Pataki, nonetheless, he's sitting there after 12 years as governor, and there's Spitzer saying, like Rip Van Winkle, we've slept through the last 10. It's shocking, frankly, at how utterly lacking in manners we tend to be in our civic life.
Alex, is it worse in New York than the rest of the country?
You know, it's a value judgment to say it's worse, but it's definitely more visible. That, you know, one of the things that when I moved from Washington to New York to cover New York City politics, the kinds of things that people in Washington sort of whisper quietly and remind you multiple times you're off the record, folks here say at their colleagues' inaugurations.
They shout.
At public ceremonies. And, you know, look, I think there's actually some value to that voters don't have any illusions about what the mayor and the governor think of each other. There's not the kind of artifice that you get somewhere else, but you do wonder on a personal level where it comes from.
Yeah, but people in Washington have started adopting the New York system in many ways. It's gotten to be very hostile, you might say. Remember the guy who yelled, "You lied"?
Yeah, he was a Southerner.
Oh, come on. That's not fair.
You mean like Eleanor? Is that what you're trying to say?
No. Eleanor's been up here long enough to be an honorary
New Yorker.
Acculturated.
Look, I do think in terms of the mayor's politics, Homer Simpson once said that the two sweetest words in the English language were default, right? And for the mayor, yes, he won the primary, but he did not have a significant opponent in the primary. He's overwhelmingly likely to win the general election. He does not have a particularly impressive opponent in the general election. And this is a huge political gift to him in some ways because he doesn't have to spend the year running. But you're then staring down the barrel of a second term where, what kind of agenda have voters been presented with and considered and, validated at the ballot box, that you don't end up with the kind of capital that you might have gotten out of at least a more of a credible token opponent.
On the other hand, arguably, didn't he do something right to get into this position?
Yeah. Only 14% of registered Democrats, something like that, voted on Tuesday. Once again, we are dismal in our civic virtue.
Talking about taking sides, Clyde, over the summer you started writing editorials as Eleanor had done before. What was that like when you used to be a reporter, then a columnist, which gave you a little more leeway?
Still a reporter.
But now editorials where you are supposed to have an opinion.
Right. Well, it's an interesting change of pace. Except for the occasional what we call an editorial notebook or an editorial observer, you write with an institutional voice, and so the egocentric part of me wonders, where's my byline? There's that getting used to.
We all can tell which one you wrote.
No, I'm not so sure. But anyway, it's really great. Look, if Douglas MacArthur had been a journalist instead of a soldier, his farewell speech would have been, "Old gas bags never die." So there's still life.
In endorsements,
Yes.
let me ask both of you, how do we decide whom to endorse?
We interview people, and we look for the best possible person, not always the person who's going to win. And
Right.
so the Times record has not always been great in terms of picking winners.
And it's not about picking winners.
It's not about picking winners. It's about picking the person we think would represent the people in a district, or as in Brooklyn, you really had the whole borough of Brooklyn to be represented by, in that case, Eric Gonzalez.
What I learned going through this process these last bunch of weeks is I actually have an admiration for a lot of folks who put themselves through the process of putting themselves in front of voters, standing at subway stations, perhaps having, the verbal equivalent of Rotten Tomatoes hurled at them. You never know. It does, especially the first timers. I mean, we've had people come in who are in their 30s, and it's very encouraging to see that there's an interest in wanting to help shape, I'm back to civic life again, but wanting to do that.
Is it presumptuous of us to tell people how to vote?
Sure, but people really look for advice about who to vote for. And you can get advice from a union, but that's skewed to the union. You can get advice from the party, but might be skewed to the party. What the Times tries to do is find candidates that agree with the way the Times thinks about public life and the governing of our city in this case.
And it might even be, for some people, a useful negative force of the Times is for it,
right.
I'm against it. And that has its own value.
Alex, the past couple of weeks, Chuck Schumer has been making a bigger name for himself. Is this going to redound to his benefit?
Well, I think it already has in a lot of ways. That, if you look back at sort of where Democrats in Congress were at the beginning of this year, they were entirely locked out of any significant conversations about governing. Republicans did not even attempt to get Democratic support for their health care legislation. We all know how that ended. The fact that Schumer, and to some extent Pelosi, but mainly Schumer, have crafted this sort of personal bridge to the White House is an enormous development, both in terms of substantive policy outcomes. If they can get some kind of compromise on DACA and border security, that would be a tremendous achievement for them. But it's also, a really important political moment for the party where, Democrats have for most of this year taken the view that the virtuous and politically useful thing to do is just to oppose the president from top to bottom. This notion of co-opting the president or trying to, sand off some of the edges of his policies and work with him on something, that's really new.
Does it suggest that the president is mellowing at all?
I think what it suggests is that the president is we've written a lot. I've written a lot about how Republicans are so fed up with Donald Trump, and I think it shows us that the feeling is really mutual. That this notion that because he won the Republican nomination, got elected as a Republican, that he owes something to Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan. We all know enough about Donald Trump to know that that's a premise that he probably doesn't accept. And just on a personal level, on a cultural level, who can you more easily imagine Donald Trump spending an hour with, Chuck Schumer or Mike Pence?
Indeed. Thanks to my Times colleague, Clyde, Haberman, Eleanor, Randolph, Alexander Burns. When we return, I'll have a few words. Remember the old joke, what's the difference between ignorance and apathy? I don't know, and I don't care. That sort of sums up this week's Democratic mayoral primary. The turnout this year was probably the second lowest in a half century. There are 3.1 million enrolled Democrats in New York City. Fewer than 450,000 voted, or about 14%. Bill de Blasio got fewer than 330,000 votes, which means that only about 1 in 10 members of his own party bothered to endorse his renomination, which also means, when you get right down to it, that in all likelihood the next mayor has just been chosen by 1 in 25 of the 8.5 million New Yorkers. Some mandate. For the most part, where turnout was highest, Mr. de Blasio did not do his best. To be fair, he won the nomination by a bigger margin than last time. He also got more votes than he did when he first ran in 2013. So, by the way, did Sal Albanese, his primary challenger. Maybe it's because the results were a foregone conclusion. After all, no elected Democratic incumbent has failed to be renominated for a second term since Abe Beame back in 1973. Maybe it's because New Yorkers are so satisfied that they saw no reason to change carriage horses in midstream. And maybe Mr. de Blasio, the first liberal mayor to get elected in good times, is disproving the conventional wisdom that progressive and ungovernable city go together. Still, imagine if more people had turned out on Tuesday, whether to cut the mayor down to size or to ratify his first term. The novelist John Dos Passos had his own definition for apathy. He described it as the one characteristic response of any living organism when it's subjected to stimuli too intense or too complicated to cope with. The cure for apathy, he said, is comprehension. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another edition of the New York Times Close Up. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.